I'm James Ford, and I'm visiting you again from Empty Moon Zen, where I have the privilege of being the guiding teacher. A lot of people ask me about the spiritual path and what does it actually look like? What are we doing? Who are we? Where does it take us? Um, a question that's haunted me all my life, and actually very early on I was blessed with a pointer, and it is in fact helped me. I in my wanderings I found a book, and I'm not sure if this is going the right direction or not, but it's called Journeys on the Razor's Edged Path, and it was by somebody named Simon's Roof. And in the first half of the 20th century, he went to India and he met many of the famous spiritual teachers of that day. And he came back and he wrote this book, and it has little anecdotes. He collects stories about his own experiences, but also traditional stories told by people. One of those stories um, um, caught me. It spoke to that spiritual path and what it might actually look like. And actually, I read the book, and it passed out of my hands, and it was only a few years ago that I stumbled upon this copy, and only book he ever wrote. I looked for him, couldn't find much information. I think he lived in New England. He may or may not have been involved in the Theosophical Society or a branch thereof. And so for me, he's this kind of wondrous person who appeared, opened some doors, and left. Uh, anyway, one of those stories stuck in my head, and I've ruminated on it and thought about it. And I reread it in the things. It's quite a bit different than the story I read, or the story I remembered that I read. And so I began to think, well, what about the story washed through my experience? And well, today I'd like to share that story with you. It, for me, a poem by Jane Hirschfeld, the Zen poet, whom I so much admire, captured the sense of it. And if you don't have much time, just listen to the poem. Otherwise, I'll follow it up with my story. The Mandarin silence of windows before their view, like guards who not to every visitor pass. Come, thief. The path to the doorway agrees. A fire requires its own conflagration, as birth does, as love does. Saying to time, to the end, dear one, enter. Once upon a time, long ago and far away, there was a burglar. She was quick-witted and nimble-footed, so she was successful in her chosen trade. However, as sometimes happens when one is good at something, she kept pushing the envelope, and with that came the disaster. She was discovered trying to break into a rich merchant's home. She fled without anyone catching a glimpse of her face. However, with the hue and cry, pretty much the whole village was soon in hot pursuit of the thief. Fortunately for her, she was just far enough ahead of the crowd that when she saw a cave opening in front of a creek, she had time to throw herself into the water, roll in the mud, and then sat, settling into a traditional meditation posture right in front of the cave. It looked exactly as if she were simply one of the many mendicants, monastics, mad people, and others who took to the road in the great spiritual quest. When the crowd arrived in front of the cave and the convincing-looking monastic, their leader saw her and said, "Oh, Holy One, did you see the thief we were chasing?" The burglar simply ignored the question and continued sitting as if she were meditating. One of the villagers said to their leader, "Can't you see she's meditating? We would earn some very bad karma if we disturb her." And then another said, "Let's wait. When she's ready, she'll speak." There was muttering of agreement, and the leader understood one leads by ordering people to do exactly what they want to do. And so they all sat on the ground in front of the thief and waited. While the burglar sat there pretending to meditate, she desperately wondered when they would move on. Instead, more and more villagers gathered. Some remained standing, most sat down. A few even began to meditate themselves. After about 2 hours, vastly longer than the burglar ever thought she could hold still, she pretended to awaken from her meditative trance. Slowly opening her eyes, she looked out at what was now 50 people, all of them quietly waiting. She cleared her throat and spoke softly, but with enough volume to be heard by everyone. "Why are you looking for some poor thief, dear ones? Wouldn't it be vastly better to search for your own true nature? After all, who isn't stealing their lives by ignoring the great questions of life and death?" With this, the villagers were overcome. Some with grief at their wasted lives, others at the call to something more important than perhaps they had ever considered before. A few ran back to the village to gather flowers to give to her. Others went home and got some food as an offering. And for a couple, not just leftovers, but treats rare in their community. Presented with the flowers and food, the burglar ate, trying not to gobble or look greedy, then asking herself what a wise person would do in a similar situation. She asked that the majority of the food be distributed among those present, asking that the poorest among them got enough, and particularly some of the best delicacies. She also handed out flowers to everyone. People felt graced. Finally, the rich merchant himself stepped forward and implored the wise nun that she remain here and grace their village with her wisdom. The burglar thought to herself, well, while I'm good at my trade as a thief, it is hard work and it is too dangerous. This holy nun gig could be an easy way to make a living. As a thief, she thought she could easily steal what she needed just by pretending to be holy. "So," she said, "I will stay with you, but only for a brief time." The villagers were ecstatic. They brought her blankets and candles, and someone even thought of bringing her a down-filled pillow. Life was comfortable, beyond what she had experienced ever. The price was that she had to pretend to meditate for hours every day. And then, in the early evening, to answer questions they would bring her. Answering questions turned out not to be that difficult. It seemed she knew what a good and generous heart would do, or, as she thought it, what a sucker might do. Not a lot of difference, she was pretty sure. Pretending to meditate, however, that was difficult. She had to hold still, and she knew people were watching, so she really had to hold still. Time passed. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. The food was good. The blankets were warm. And oh my, that pillow. But her meditating continued to be a terrible ordeal. The burglar was forced to sit. There were simply too many witnesses. She experimented with her posture, trying to find a position that wasn't painful. She began to sit on that pillow and gradually became comfortable sitting cross-legged. Over time, her knees began to drop and then touch the ground. And then there was her mind. She fantasized about everything that had happened in her life, how she was raised, the poverty, the violence, the gift of learning to read at the local temple, and the reading of books. There weren't many, but she read them over and over. Then there was her trade. figuring out how to steal without getting caught, experiencing what happened early on when she was caught, the moments of joy and the long times of boredom and intermittent flashes of terror. She also fantasized about the future, about what new treats the villagers might bring, about what she would do when she tired of all this and returned to the road and a life of burglary. But as she passed in her imagination from the past to the future, increasingly she noticed something. Just for a moment. At first it was like a flashing silence. Then gradually it grew larger in her consciousness. After a while, as those weeks passed into those months, that space, that quiet, that just being present became a large part of her holding still, pretending to meditate. That pretending was becoming something. She couldn't say what, but it was now different. As she began to notice, began to notice how she saw the villagers differently, and even how she saw the words that came out of her mouth. She gradually came to know the villagers, their sorrows, how they would be so petty and even sometimes cruel, their various intrigues in their lives, their loves as they arose, sometimes fell apart, sometimes deepened, as well as their many generosities, sometimes unconscious, sometimes grand, and even costly. Gradually, she began to love them. And she began to see how her own life, which she was becoming ever more aware of in painful and minute detail, just through the repetitions of her own mind playing around the silences, was just like theirs. She knew they were different, and yet somehow, mysteriously, they were also one. Increasingly, as she spoke, everything she shared was based in that mystery, that they were different and that they were more closely connected than the finest woven fabric. Then the boy appeared. He approached her one evening, made bows, and said he had been wandering looking for a teacher. And he began to hear of this amazing nun who spoke wisely and, more importantly, modeled the great gift of silent meditation. He declared he wanted to become her student. Not knowing what to do, she simply ignored him. He took a place in the dirt below her, and as she began to pretend to meditate, he sat quietly. The next day she told him to go. She wasn't interested in having disciples. But he continued to sit with her at a respectful distance. She knew she had to pretend to be generous, so she made sure he was fed. And before long, the villagers made sure he had blankets and even a pillow of his own. He seemed much less interested in them than she was. What he seemed to love was sitting quietly. She asked him what he was doing while meditating. He said he did what he was taught when he first decided to walk the spiritual path. He counted his breath, putting a 1 on his inhalation, then exhaled, then put a 2 on the next inhalation, and continuing on until he came to 10, after which he would repeat the process. She said nothing. Then she tried it for herself and discovered it helped with her concentration, but it also tended to obscure the quiet place that seemed increasingly interesting to her. So, a few days later, she told him that he might just try sitting quietly, not trying to think, not trying to not think. And he did. She began to wonder if it was time to escape. The problem was that there were villagers around pretty much all the time. And the boy, well, he was around all the time. So, the burglar was stuck. Over time, the burglar grew ever more quiet. She witnessed the day as it began. She witnessed the day as it passed. She witnessed the evening as it arose. Her last moment before sleep was noticing, witnessing, being present. And her words almost always came from that place, the place where she saw she and they were all the same. Increasingly, she talked about the silence, about what she found and what they might find. One day, the boy came to her and said that when he took a walk down by the creek, a crow called out. And in that moment, he realized the crow, the creek, the trees, he himself, and all things were joined so closely that the right word for what was true and present was simply one. He then added, embarrassed, how he knew even that one seemed a bit too much. She wasn't sure what to say, so she simply smiled at him, put her hands together, and made a small bow. They continued together in this way as the months turned to years. She wasn't sure when it happened for herself. In fact, she never had that big thing like her disciple. What she did have was a gradual growing into peace and joy and gratitude for it all. Eventually, her fame as a wise counselor and teacher of the ways of the heart spread across the country. She was attended to faithfully by her disciple, who was increasingly seen as a wise teacher himself. Eventually, a small community of monks and nuns gathered around her, and within the village, others seemed to become wise as well. Eventually, she fell ill, but that seemed okay. Her disciples tended to her, and that was okay. The villagers came to ask her last questions, and that was okay. The world, as terrible as it was also something wonderful, something amazing. And when she died, her senior disciple, now a wise and respected counselor, oversaw the burning of her corpse. He installed her ashes under some rocks out beyond the small monastery of nuns and monks that had grown over the years. The community elected him to succeed their founding teacher. Always before he lectured on the mysteries of the way, he would always thank the good gods that he had been given such a wonderful guide on the mysteries of life and death. The teacher who stole his delusions, and in doing so, opened his heart. Thank you all.